October 12th, 1943. Imperial Japanese Naval Headquarters, Tokyo. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki set down the latest intelligence summary with hands that had begun, imperceptibly, to shake. The document contained photographic reconnaissance from submarines operating off the American west coast, detailed analyses from naval attachés in neutral countries, and intercepts of American industrial production reports. The numbers were impossible, statistically absurd, yet they kept appearing in report after report from independent sources who had no reason to coordinate fabrications. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 90 destroyers commissioned in 6 months. 90. His own combined fleet had begun the war with 113 destroyers total, accumulated over 2 decades of construction. The Americans had matched 80% of Japan's entire pre-war destroyer force in half a year, while simultaneously fighting a 2-ocean war, supplying Britain and Russia, and maintaining merchant shipping that exceeded Japan's entire merchant marine. Ugaki walked to the window overlooking Tokyo Bay, where the remnants of Japan's once mighty fleet lay at anchor. He could see the cruiser Tone, freshly returned from the South Pacific with battle damage that would take months to repair. He could see empty berths where destroyers should have been moored, destroyers that now rested on the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound off Guadalcanal. And in that moment, staring at those empty spaces, Vice Admiral Ugaki understood with crystalline clarity what Japan's leadership had refused to acknowledge for 2 years. They had not attacked a nation. They had attacked an industrial civilization whose productive capacity operated on a scale that Japan's military planners literally could not comprehend. The mathematics were writing Japan's defeat in numbers, too large to dispute, too systematic to dismiss as propaganda. Somewhere across the Pacific, in shipyards that Japan's admirals had never visited and could scarcely imagine, American workers were launching a destroyer every 2 days, not building one every 2 days, launching one, commissioning it, sending it to war. The calculation was simple, brutal, and inescapable. For every Japanese destroyer sunk, America could replace it with 10, and they were sinking Japanese destroyers at a rate that made replacement impossible. The seeds of this industrial apocalypse had been planted long before Pearl Harbor, though Japanese naval intelligence had either missed or dismissed the warning signs. On June 19, 1938, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Naval Act of 1938, authorizing a 20% increase in the United States Navy's tonnage. The bill passed with bipartisan support in both houses of Congress, a remarkable achievement in an America still deeply divided between isolationists and interventionists. The authorization included provisions for 9 new destroyers, but more critically, it included funding to expand American shipbuilding capacity itself. William Knudsen, president of General Motors, was watching. So was Henry Kaiser, whose construction company had just completed the Bonneville Dam 18 months ahead of schedule. So were the executives at Bethlehem Steel, at Newport News Shipbuilding, at Bath Iron Works. They understood what Japan's naval planners did not. America wasn't simply authorizing new ships. America was authorizing the industrial infrastructure to build ships at scales the world had never witnessed. The Japanese Naval General Staff received reports about American naval expansion, of course. These documents were read, analyzed, and filed away with assessments that reveal, in retrospect, a catastrophic failure of imagination. A typical Japanese intelligence summary from 1939 concluded that American shipyards, designed for commercial vessels and small naval craft, would require years of retooling to produce fleet destroyers in meaningful numbers. The analysis noted that American shipyards lacked the specialized workforce trained in naval construction. It observed that destroyer production required precision engineering incompatible with American mass production techniques. It calculated, with careful mathematical precision, that the United States might, at maximum capacity, produce 30 to 40 destroyers annually by 1943 or 1944. Every single assumption was wrong. The destroyer that would doom these calculations was conceived at a drafting table in the Bureau of Ships in Washington, D.C., in 1939. The Fletcher-class destroyer represented a fundamental shift in American naval philosophy, though its significance wouldn't become apparent until hundreds had been built. Previous American destroyers had been designed as individual ships, craft meant to be constructed by skilled naval shipwrights in established naval yards. The Fletcher was designed as a system, a product engineered for mass production by workers who had never seen a warship. The specifications were revolutionary in their pragmatism: 21-inch torpedo tubes instead of the smaller calibers that required specialized manufacturing, 5-inch guns in single mounts rather than complex twin turrets, steam turbines and boilers that shared components with merchant ship engines, hull plating that could be welded rather than riveted, cutting construction time by 40%, fire control systems that used standardized components, electrical systems based on commercial specifications. Nothing about the Fletcher was exotic. Nothing about it was a masterpiece of individual craftsmanship. It was, in the words of one Naval Bureau engineer, deliberately ordinary. A ship designed to be built by the tens, then hundreds, by workers, whose previous experience involved automobiles, not warships. Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, approved the Fletcher design on October 9, 1939, 2 months after the German invasion of Poland. He authorized construction of the first 24 ships across multiple shipyards, a decision that would prove more consequential than any battle plan drawn up before Pearl Harbor. The first Fletcher-class keel was laid at Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Kearney, New Jersey, on October 4, 1941. Nicholas, hull number DD 449, 63 days before Pearl Harbor. The workers who assembled her hull had been building merchant ships 6 months earlier. The welders had come from automobile factories. The electricians had wired commercial buildings. Yet under the supervision of a handful of experienced naval contractors, they produced a destroyer in 11 months. Nicholas was commissioned on June 4, 1942, the day the Battle of Midway began 4,000 miles to the west. While Japanese carrier aircraft burned on the Pacific, American shipyards were demonstrating a different kind of naval power: the power to replace losses faster than they occurred, the power to build not dozens but hundreds of destroyers, the power to wage industrial warfare on a scale that rendered tactical brilliance increasingly irrelevant. Japan's admirals would spend the next 3 years learning what that power meant. The Japanese Navy's destroyer force in December 1941 represented the culmination of 2 decades of focused development. 113 destroyers, many of them the most technically advanced surface combatants in any navy. The special-type destroyers, the Fubuki class and their successors, had revolutionized destroyer design in the 1920s. They featured enclosed twin-gun turrets when other navies' destroyers still mounted open single guns. They carried the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, with a range of 22 miles and a 1,200-pound warhead, more than double the range and warhead weight of American torpedoes. Japanese destroyer doctrine emphasized night combat and aggressive torpedo attacks. Crews trained for years in night navigation, in coordinated attacks, in the art of closing with enemy forces to launch their devastating torpedoes. At the Battle of Savo Island on August 9, 1942, Japanese destroyers demonstrated this doctrine with terrifying effectiveness, sinking 4 Allied heavy cruisers in 32 minutes with virtually no losses. Every victory reinforced Japanese naval confidence: superior training, superior tactics, superior torpedoes. The mathematics of individual combat consistently favored Japanese destroyers. In the 13 naval battles fought around Guadalcanal between August 1942 and February 1943, Japanese destroyers sank 29 Allied warships, while losing 24 of their own, a favorable kill ratio. But while Japanese commanders focused on kill ratios, American shipyards were rewriting the equation. The shipyard at Bath Iron Works in Maine had been building destroyers since the First World War. In 1940, it produced 1 destroyer every 14 months. In 1941, with Fletcher-class contracts arriving and workforce expanding, that fell to 11 months. By mid-1942, Bath Iron Works had cut construction time to 9 months. The entire yard operated on 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Welding torches burned through the night. Cranes swung hull sections into position by floodlight. Assembly line techniques from automotive manufacturing had been adapted to destroyer construction. Federal Shipbuilding in Kearney, New Jersey, achieved even more dramatic results. The yard had hired nearly 15,000 workers by early 1943, most with no shipbuilding experience. They organized Fletcher construction into modular sections. The forward hull, containing crew quarters and magazines, was assembled in one area, the engineering spaces, with boilers and turbines, in another, the stern section with depth charge racks in a third. Each section was largely completed before final assembly, allowing parallel construction that slashed production time. By March 1943, Federal Shipbuilding was launching a Fletcher-class destroyer every 45 days. That single shipyard was outproducing Japan's entire destroyer construction industry, and Federal Shipbuilding was just one of 11 yards building Fletchers: Boston Naval Shipyard in Massachusetts, Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Washington, Charleston Naval Shipyard in South Carolina, Gulf Shipbuilding in Alabama, Consolidated Steel in Texas, Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding in Washington, Todd Pacific Shipyards in Seattle, Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, Bethlehem Steel in California, Bath Iron Works in Maine, Federal Shipbuilding in New Jersey, 11 shipyards, each receiving Fletcher contracts, each implementing mass production techniques that Japanese naval architects had dismissed as impossible for complex warships. The production numbers tell the story Japanese admirals refused to believe. January 1942, 0 Fletchers commissioned. February 1942, 0. March 1942, 0. April 1942, 1 Fletcher commissioned. May, 2. June, 3. The curve was beginning. July 1942, 4 Fletchers commissioned. August, 5. September, 6. October, 7. November, 8. December 1942, 9 Fletcher-class destroyers commissioned. The curve was accelerating. January 1943, 12 Fletchers commissioned. February, 14. March, 15. The mathematical progression was relentless. April 1943, 18 new Fletchers entered service. May, 21. June 1943, 24 Fletcher-class destroyers commissioned in a single month. In 6 months, from January through June 1943, 99 Fletcher-class destroyers were commissioned, 99, in half a year, while simultaneously fighting across 2 oceans, while building cruisers and battleships and aircraft carriers and submarines and merchant ships and landing craft. Japan managed to commission 15 destroyers during the same 6-month period. 15 against 99. A ratio of 6.6 to 1. And Japan was struggling to achieve even those 15, cannibalizing spare parts from damaged ships, extending construction times as skilled workers were drafted for combat duty, watching helplessly as American submarines interdicted raw materials from the South Pacific. The destroyers themselves reveal the philosophical chasm between American and Japanese approaches to naval construction. Every Fletcher-class destroyer was essentially identical. Same guns, same torpedoes, same engines, same hull, same electrical system. A crew trained on Nicholas, DD-449, could immediately serve on Radford, DD-446, or Jenkins, DD-447, or any of the 175 Fletchers eventually commissioned. Parts were interchangeable, maintenance procedures were standardized, supply chains were simplified. This standardization, which Japanese naval architects viewed as lack of sophistication, proved to be devastating strategic advantage. When the destroyer Chevalier DD-451 was torpedoed and sunk at the Battle of Vella La Vella on October 6, 1943, her surviving crew members were distributed among other Fletcher destroyers within 72 hours. They required no additional training. They knew every valve, every switch, every procedure. The destroyer O'Bannon, DD-450, which participated in the battle, had 1 damaged gun mount replaced in 48 hours, using parts stock that existed in every Pacific depot. Japanese destroyers, by contrast, were products of constant, incremental improvement. The Fubuki class gave way to the Akatsuki class, with modified bridge structure. The Akatsuki gave way to the Hatsuharu class, with improved stability. The Hatsuharu was followed by the Shiratsuyu, the Asashio, the Kagero, the Yugumo. Each class incorporated lessons from the previous, each made slightly different, better in some ways, but incompatible. Crew members trained on one class required weeks of familiarization with another. Parts for Fubuki-class destroyers didn't fit Kagero-class ships. Repair depots needed separate inventory for each class. Training schools had to teach multiple systems. The philosophy behind these differences reflected deeper assumptions about warfare. Japan believed that superior individual units, crewed by superbly trained sailors, would overcome numerical disadvantages through tactical excellence. Each Japanese destroyer was expected to be better than its American counterpart, and in direct combat, one-on-one, that expectation was often met. The long-lance torpedo outranged anything America possessed. Japanese optical rangefinders were superior to early American radar. Japanese crews had more training, more experience, more expertise in night combat. America believed that adequate units, produced in overwhelming numbers and supplied without interruption, would render tactical excellence operationally irrelevant. Each American destroyer just needed to be good enough, and good enough, multiplied by hundreds, with fuel that never ran short and ammunition that was always replenished, proved absolutely sufficient. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, on November 2, 1943, illustrated this reality with brutal clarity. Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori commanded a force of 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 6 destroyers, sent to disrupt American landings on Omori, Bougainville. The American force under Rear Admiral Aaron Merrill had 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers, 4 of them brand-new Fletchers commissioned within the previous 3 months. The battle began just after 1 o'clock in the morning. Japanese long-lance torpedoes immediately crippled the destroyer Foot, DD-511, requiring it to withdraw. The destroyer Spence, DD-512, was hit by gunfire. The Americans lost tactical initiative within 15 minutes. According to pre-war doctrine, according to 2 years of Pacific combat, the Japanese force should have achieved decisive victory. Superior torpedoes, superior night fighting experience, tactical advantage. Instead, the Americans overwhelmed them with sustained gunfire from multiple directions. American radar-directed 5-inch guns hit Japanese ships that Japanese optical rangefinders couldn't even locate. When Omori's heavy cruiser Myoko was damaged, forcing him to withdraw, the Americans simply maintained contact, continuing to hammer the Japanese force. The American destroyers absorbed damage, returned fire, and stayed in the fight because they knew replacement ships were available. Japanese destroyers, knowing each loss was essentially irreplaceable, withdrew when prudence dictated, rather than accepting exchange ratios that would have been favorable in any previous era. Omori lost 1 light cruiser and 1 destroyer sunk, with 4 ships damaged. The Americans lost no ships, though 3 required repairs. But the real story wasn't the tactical outcome. The real story was that within 2 weeks, all 3 damaged American destroyers had returned to service with replacement parts shipped from Pearl Harbor. The destroyer Foot, most seriously damaged, was repaired and back in action by December 15th. The Japanese light cruiser Sendai, sunk in the battle, could not be replaced. The destroyer Hatsukaze, damaged, required 3 months of repairs in Singapore, cannibalizing parts from other ships. This pattern, repeated dozens of times across the Pacific, was rewriting the naval war. American destroyers could accept battle damage because replacement destroyers were arriving faster than losses occurred. Japanese destroyers had to preserve themselves because losses exceeded Japan's ability to replace them, even though Japanese destroyers were individually superior in several respects. Admiral Minechi Koga, who had replaced Admiral Yamamoto after his death in April 1943, received regular intelligence summaries about American destroyer production. His marginalia on these documents, preserved in Japanese naval archives, reveals the progression of his understanding. Early notes from mid-1943 query the figures. Is this number confirmed? Can American shipyards truly produce at this rate? By late 1943, the questions cease. The numbers are annotated with calculations, comparing American production rates to Japanese losses, projecting future force levels. The mathematics led to only one conclusion. Japan was losing the destroyer force with which it had begun the war, and the force arriving to replace those losses was smaller, less experienced, and increasingly unable to challenge American naval dominance. In December 1943, Admiral Koga made a fateful decision. He ordered remaining Japanese destroyers to withdraw from forward combat operations whenever possible, preserving them for a final decisive battle that Japanese planning still hoped might turn the war. The destroyers that had sunk Allied cruisers at Savo Island, that had evacuated Guadalcanal under fire, that had fought with distinction in every major Pacific engagement, were now too valuable to risk in the grinding attrition that American industrial production had made inevitable. The effect was immediate and devastating. Without destroyer screens, Japanese supply convoys became increasingly vulnerable to American submarines. Without destroyer support, Japanese heavy units couldn't operate in contested waters. Without destroyers to evacuate garrisons, Japanese island bases had to be held until annihilated. The very attempt to preserve destroyer strength accelerated its strategic irrelevance. Meanwhile, in the shipyards of Seattle and Boston and Alabama, the production continued without pause. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The human dimension of American destroyer production revealed advantages that Japanese naval planning had never anticipated. At Bath Iron Works in Maine, the workforce grew from 3,000 in 1940 to 14,000 by mid-1943. These workers weren't career shipbuilders. They were farmers from inland Maine, housewives from Portland, teenagers who had left high school to support the war effort, elderly men who had retired from other industries. Margaret Chase, who would later become Maine's first female senator, worked the night shift as a welder at Bath Iron Works in 1943. She recalled the experience in a 1976 interview. "None of us had seen a destroyer before we started building them. They gave us 3 weeks of training. They showed us the blueprints, taught us to read the specifications, and then put us on the line. I welded hull seams on 7 different destroyers. Every ship that left our yard carried work I had done with my own hands. We knew our brothers and sons would serve on those ships. That knowledge made us meticulous. This democratic mobilization, workers volunteering rather than being conscripted, proved more efficient than Japan's increasingly desperate labor policies. By late 1943, Japanese shipyards were relying heavily on Korean forced labor and prisoners of war. These workers had every incentive to sabotage production, and they did. Welding. Inspections at Japanese yards found defect rates exceeding 30% by 1944. American yards, staffed by citizens invested in victory, maintained defect rates below 2%. The productivity gap widened further when considering work hours. American shipyard workers, well-fed and adequately rested, could maintain 3 8-hour shifts indefinitely. Japanese workers, facing food rationing and increasingly frequent air raids, saw productivity decline even as nominal work hours increased. A worker producing at 80% efficiency for 16 hours generates less output than a worker at 100% efficiency for 8 hours, particularly when quality control is factored in. Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding Corporation exemplified American production philosophy at its most effective. The yard had never built a naval vessel before receiving Fletcher contracts in 1942. The management consisted of former Boeing aircraft executives who understood mass production but knew nothing about ships. They hired naval architects from the East Coast as consultants, studied the blueprints, and then applied automotive assembly line principles to destroyer construction. They built jigs, enormous metal frames that held hull sections in precise alignment while welders worked. This eliminated the skilled labor previously required to align plates by eye and measurement. They prefabricated entire compartments on assembly lines, installing equipment and running cables before the compartments were welded into the hull. This allowed electricians and pipe fitters to work in well-lit shops, rather than cramped spaces inside partially built ships. They developed specialized welding torches that reduced the skill level required for acceptable welds. A welder with 3 weeks of training using these tools produced results comparable to a traditionally trained welder with 3 years of experience. Seattle-Tacoma's first Fletcher, commissioned in July 1943, required 9 months from keel laying to commissioning. Their 20th Fletcher, commissioned in May 1944, required 6 months. Their production time had decreased by 33% through continuous process improvement, the kind of incremental optimization that American manufacturing culture enabled and Japanese rigid hierarchies inhibited. By mid-1944, 11 American shipyards were collectively commissioning Fletcher-class destroyers at a rate exceeding 1 every 2 days. Not building at that rate, commissioning at that rate, completing ships, training crews, and sending them to war faster than Japan's entire naval construction industry could produce destroyers of all classes combined. The strategic implications became undeniable at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. The United States Navy deployed 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers to cover the invasion of Saipan. 69 destroyers, more than half the number Japan had possessed at the start of the war. And these weren't the surviving ships from 1941. These were mostly new construction. Destroyers that hadn't existed when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The Japanese mobile fleet, representing nearly everything Japan could still deploy, consisted of 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 28 destroyers. The destroyer ratio was 2.5 to 1 in America's favor. More significantly, the American destroyers were fully fueled, fully armed, and supported by a logistical system that could replenish both instantly. The Japanese destroyers operated at the extreme limit of their range, with partial fuel loads to maximize operational radius, with ammunition restricted by supply shortages. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the mobile fleet, understood the mathematical reality he faced. His after-action report, written in the careful language of an officer who knew his words would be scrutinized by superiors unwilling to hear hard truths, nevertheless conveyed the essential fact. American material superiority had reached the point where tactical skill could no longer compensate. The Americans could afford to lose ships. Japan could not. The Americans could replace losses within weeks. Japan required months or years. The Americans operated with the confidence of overwhelming force. Japan operated with the desperation of diminishing strength. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The destruction of Japanese naval power at the Philippine Sea, losing 3 carriers and approximately 400 aircraft while sinking no American capital ships, was attributed to many factors: better American aircraft, superior American training, overwhelming American numbers. But underlying all these factors was the industrial capacity that made American numerical superiority possible and sustainable. In the 6 months following the Philippine Sea battle, the United States commissioned 58 more Fletcher-class destroyers. 58. Japan commissioned 9 destroyers of all classes, including small escort destroyers barely qualified as fleet units. The ratio had widened to more than 6 to 1. And this ratio understated the real disparity, because American destroyers arrived with full crews, complete equipment, adequate fuel, and ammunition stocks sufficient for sustained operations. Japanese destroyers increasingly arrived undermanned, with substitute equipment, partial fuel loads, and ammunition rationed to conserve dwindling stocks. The Japanese Naval General Staff knew these numbers. Intelligence reports provided accurate assessments of American shipbuilding. What the General Staff couldn't seem to grasp was that numbers of this magnitude altered the fundamental nature of naval warfare. Tactics designed for battles between comparable forces became irrelevant when one side could replace every loss and the other could not. Commander Tamechihara, who survived the war as one of Japan's most experienced destroyer captains, described the psychological effect in his post-war memoir. By 1944, we no longer fought to win, we fought to delay. We knew that every American destroyer we sank would be replaced by 3 more within a month. We knew that our own losses were permanent. We fought with skill and courage, but we fought without hope. The Americans weren't better sailors. They weren't braver men. They simply had more ships than we could possibly sink, and we had fewer ships than we could afford to lose. This loss of hope, the psychological weight of fighting an enemy whose material resources appeared infinite, affected Japanese destroyer operations more than any tactical defeat. Crews who had fought aggressively in 1942 became cautious in 1944. Not from cowardice, but from the knowledge that aggressive tactics which had worked when forces were comparable led only to futile sacrifice when facing overwhelming numerical superiority. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, in October 1944, demonstrated the terminal stage of Japanese destroyer force degradation. The complex Japanese battle plan required coordination between multiple forces spread across hundreds of miles. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force included 14 destroyers, the core of Japan's remaining fleet destroyer strength. These ships, and their crews, represented 2 decades of naval development and training. They were asked to penetrate through the San Bernardino Strait, evade or defeat American carrier air power, and destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte. The mission was, in sober analysis, impossible, not because Japanese destroyer crews lacked skill or courage, but because the Americans could afford to throw resources at the problem until it was solved. When Kurita's force emerged from San Bernardino Strait on the morning of October 25th, American escort carriers launched every available aircraft. These weren't fleet carriers with hundreds of planes. These were small escort carriers with fewer than 30 aircraft each. But there were 16 escort carriers in the vicinity, and they launched wave after wave of attacks. The destroyer, Johnston, DD-557, a Fletcher commissioned in October 1943, made a suicidal torpedo run against Kurita's battleships and cruisers. The destroyer, Hole, DD-533, another Fletcher, followed Johnston into point-blank range. The destroyer, Heermann, DD-532, laid a smoke screen and engaged Japanese heavy cruisers with 5-inch guns. All 3 destroyers were sunk or disabled. By the tactical standards that had governed naval warfare for centuries, the Americans had lost the destroyer engagement. But 3 more American destroyers arrived within 2 hours to replace them, and 6 more arrived the next day, and 12 more the day after that. The American destroyer force was essentially inexhaustible at operational timescales. Every loss, no matter how tactically significant, was strategically irrelevant, because replacement destroyers were already en route from Pearl Harbor, from California, from the Panama Canal, from every direction, in numbers that made good the losses before Japanese commanders could even count their victories. Kurita's force, having lost 3 heavy cruisers and multiple destroyers to American air and surface attacks, withdrew. The mission had failed. Not because Japanese destroyers had fought poorly. They had fought magnificently, with skill that impressed even their enemies. They failed because magnificence couldn't overcome mathematics. Japan had committed 14 destroyers. America had deployed more than 100 destroyers to the Philippine operations. The 14, no matter how skilled, couldn't defeat 100. And if they had somehow managed that impossible victory, another 100 American destroyers were already en route. Japanese naval leadership finally confronted the full scope of their strategic miscalculation in November 1944. Admiral Soimu Toyoda, who had replaced Admiral Koga as Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, received a comprehensive intelligence assessment of American naval strength. The report, compiled by staff officers who had finally abandoned optimistic assumptions in favor of documented facts, listed American destroyer strength at 412 vessels, with another 97 under construction or fitting out, 412 destroyers, against Japan's remaining 73, of which only 41 were operational, a ratio of 10-1 in actual combat-ready hulls. The report noted that American destroyer construction continued at a rate of 6 to 8 commissionings monthly, while Japanese construction had fallen to 1 or 2 monthly. The projection was stark. By mid-1945, America would possess over 500 destroyers. Japan would, optimistically, possess 50. Toyoda's marginal notes on this report, preserved in post-war archives, reveal his state of mind. Next to the figure, 412 American destroyers, he had written a single word: impossible. Then, apparently after further reflection, he had crossed out impossible and written, "We never understood." That phrase, "we never understood," encapsulated Japan's fundamental failure. Japanese naval planning had assumed that war with America would be decided by tactical excellence and fighting spirit. This assumption wasn't stupid or irrational. It was based on Japan's experience in the Russo-Japanese War, where tactical brilliance at Tsushima had indeed defeated a numerically superior enemy. It was based on Japanese naval performance in the early months of the Pacific War, where superior night fighting techniques and better torpedoes had won repeated victories. What Japanese planners hadn't understood was that America's industrial capacity operated at a scale qualitatively different from anything Japan had experienced. Russia in 1905 had been an agricultural nation with limited industrial development. America in 1944 was the most industrialized nation in history, with manufacturing capacity exceeding the rest of the world combined. The destroyer production that stunned Japanese admirals represented only a fraction of American shipbuilding. While producing 352 destroyers during the war, American shipyards simultaneously produced 127 aircraft carriers of all types, 23 battleships, 72 cruisers, 422 submarines, and over 5,000 merchant vessels. The destroyer program consumed approximately 15% of American naval construction capacity. This meant that America's destroyer production, which alone exceeded Japan's total naval construction, was accomplished almost as an aside, while building everything else needed for a two-ocean global war. Japanese shipyards had devoted their entire capacity to naval construction and still couldn't match American destroyer output, much less compete with total American shipbuilding. The human cost of this industrial disparity became brutally apparent in the war's final months. Japanese destroyers, reduced to suicidal missions because conventional naval operations were no longer viable, suffered casualty rates exceeding 70%. Of the 176 destroyers Japan operated during the war, 134 were sunk. The survival rate for Japanese destroyer crewmen was barely 20%. American Fletcher-class destroyers, despite seeing extensive combat across the Pacific, suffered remarkably light losses. Of 175 Fletchers commissioned, only 19 were lost to enemy action during the war. The survival rate exceeded 90%. American destroyer crewmen faced danger, certainly, but they faced it with the knowledge that their ship represented one of hundreds, that losses would be replaced, that the industrial power backing them made survival statistically likely. This disparity in survival rates reflected not cowardice on one side and bravery on the other, but the simple mathematics of industrial warfare. Japanese destroyers had to take desperate risks because Japan had no other options. American destroyers could employ more cautious tactics because America had resources to achieve objectives through weight of numbers rather than individual heroism. The final reckoning came at Okinawa in the spring of 1945. The United States deployed 41 destroyers for radar picket duty, placing them forward of the main fleet to provide early warning of kamikaze attacks. These destroyers absorbed the brunt of suicide attacks. With 16 sunk or so heavily damaged, they were scrapped. By conventional calculation, losing 16 destroyers would have been a catastrophic defeat, requiring operational pause to reconstitute forces. The Americans simply brought up replacement destroyers from the vast reserves available. Within 72 hours of every sinking, a replacement destroyer took station on the picket line. The Japanese, watching this demonstration of industrial power, finally understood the magnitude of their miscalculation. They were fighting an enemy who could lose 16 destroyers in 6 weeks and not even slow down, because the shipyards back in America were producing replacement destroyers faster than kamikazes could sink them. Admiral Matome Ugaki, who had set down that intelligence report in October 1943 with shaking hands, died in the final days of the war, leading a kamikaze attack on American ships off Okinawa. His last diary entry, written the night before his death, reflected on the destroyer force that had been destroyed not in battle but in shipyards. "We trained the finest destroyer crews in the world. We built excellent ships. We developed superior tactics. None of it mattered. The Americans built destroyers faster than we could sink them. They replaced losses before our victory reports reached Tokyo. We were not defeated by better sailors. We were defeated by better factories." When Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, the ceremony took place aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Surrounding Missouri were dozens of American destroyers, most of them Fletchers, most of them commissioned after Japan had already lost the war but didn't yet know it. These ships represented the physical manifestation of industrial power, the visible proof that naval warfare between industrialized nations would be decided not by tactical skill, but by productive capacity. Japanese naval officers, boarding American ships to arrange surrender details, consistently expressed shock at the material abundance evident on every American vessel. Fresh paint, new equipment, full fuel tanks, stockpiled ammunition. Well-fed crews. These weren't the signs of a nation exhausted by 4 years of global war. These were the signs of a nation whose industrial production had actually accelerated during wartime, whose factories had grown more efficient rather than less, whose workers had increased output rather than succumbing to fatigue. Captain Toshikazu Omai, of the Japanese Naval General Staff, toured several American destroyers in early September 1945. His report to superiors described American ships as floating warehouses of equipment we couldn't obtain even before the war began. Every destroyer carried spare parts for every system, replacement equipment for damage control, sufficient ammunition for extended operations, and reserve fuel beyond operational requirements. Our destroyers, when they existed at all, operated with partial fuel, minimal ammunition, and substitute equipment. We lost not because their ships were better, but because they had enough ships that quality became irrelevant. The Fletcher-class destroyer program had commissioned 175 ships between June 1942 and February 1945, 32 months, an average of 5.5 destroyers monthly over nearly 3 years of sustained production. This figure, which had seemed impossible to Japanese intelligence analysts in 1943, was actually understated because it didn't include the 67 Allen M. Sumner-class destroyers commissioned during the same period, or the 45 Gearing-class destroyers beginning to commission in late 1944 and early 1945. Total American destroyer commissionings from Pearl Harbor to Japanese surrender, 352 vessels. Total Japanese destroyer commissionings in the same period, 63 vessels, a ratio of 5.6 to 1. But the operational ratio was even more lopsided because American destroyers arrived fully equipped and remained fully supplied throughout their service, while Japanese destroyers increasingly operated at partial capability due to fuel, ammunition, and parts shortages. The industrial mathematics that produced this disparity were actually quite simple, though their implications were profound. America possessed 42 major shipyards capable of building destroyers. Japan possessed 11. America had virtually unlimited steel production, approximately 81 million tons in 1944 alone. Japan produced less than 4 million tons in the same year, much of it from lower-grade ore. America had unrestricted oil supplies, producing over 4 million barrels daily in 1944. Japan's oil imports had been reduced to a trickle by submarine warfare, forcing synthetic fuel production that was inadequate and inferior. Most critically, America had an industrial workforce of 63 million, including 18 million women who had entered war production work. Japan's industrial workforce, even including forced labor from occupied territories, never exceeded 12 million. American workers were well-fed, adequately housed, and motivated by democratic investment in national survival. Japanese workers increasingly suffered malnutrition, housing destroyed by air raids, and the psychological burden of knowing their labor supported a losing cause. These factors, steel, oil, workers, motivation combined to to create industrial capacity differentials that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Japanese destroyer captains were among the finest naval officers in the world. Their crews were superbly trained. Their tactics were sophisticated. None of it mattered once American industrial production reached full mobilization. The destroyers they sank were replaced before the battle reports could be filed. The experience they gained in combat was negated by the sheer weight of American numerical superiority. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had opposed war with America and whose supposed quote about awakening a sleeping giant captured the reality, if not the actual words, had understood this from the beginning. His prediction that Japan could run wild for 6 months before American production took effect proved remarkably accurate. Pearl Harbor to Midway, December 7, 1941 to June 4, 1942, exactly 6 months. The period of Japanese tactical ascendancy before American industrial power began to manifest at sea. After Midway, the war became a race between Japanese tactical skill and American production capacity. For a year, from mid-1942 to mid-1943, the outcome appeared uncertain. Japanese destroyers continued to win tactical victories. American destroyers absorbed heavy losses in the Solomons. The kill ratios favored Japan, but the production ratios favored America, and production ratios ultimately determined strategic outcomes in industrial warfare. By mid-1943, when Vice Admiral Ugaki set down that intelligence report about 90 destroyers in 6 months, the race was effectively over. Japan's destroyer force had peaked and begun its irreversible decline. America's destroyer force had reached critical mass and would continue expanding until victory was achieved. The mathematics were inescapable. Japan started with 113 destroyers, built 63 more during the war, and lost 134 total. Final count: 42 survivors, many damaged. America started with 169 destroyers, built 352 more during the war, and lost 71 total. Final count: 450, with more under construction. The ratio at war's end was 10.7 to 1 in terms of surviving hulls. But the meaningful ratio was actually infinite, because America could have built another 1,000 destroyers if necessary, while Japan's shipbuilding capacity had been bombed into rubble and could build nothing at all. The lesson that emerged from the destroyer production race was uncomfortable for those who valued individual excellence over systemic capability. It suggested that a sufficient quantitative advantage could overcome almost any qualitative disadvantage. It suggested that industrial capacity mattered more than tactical skill. It suggested that factories were more important than fighting spirit. These conclusions ran counter to centuries of military tradition that emphasized the decisive importance of superior weapons, better training, and individual courage. But the destroyer production numbers didn't care about tradition. They simply demonstrated that when one side could produce 6 destroyers for every destroyer, the other side produced. And when one side could keep those destroyers fully fueled and armed, while the other side operated at partial capability, the side with superior production would win regardless of individual tactical outcomes. American workers who had built destroyers in the shipyards of Seattle and Maine and New Jersey never fired a shot in anger. They never saw the battles their ships fought. Many never even saw the ships after launching, as the vessels were fitted out and sent to war while they began building the next hull. Yet their contribution to victory was, in aggregate, more decisive than any individual battle. The destroyers they built gave American admirals the luxury of accepting tactical defeats because strategic victory was assured by the endless stream of replacement ships arriving from the continental United States. Japanese destroyer crewmen, conversely, fought with exceptional skill in a losing cause because their national leadership had fundamentally misunderstood modern warfare. They had believed that quality would overcome quantity, that spirit would overcome steel, that tactical excellence would overcome industrial superiority. These beliefs had worked against Russia in 1905. They had worked against China in the 1930s. They did not work against America in the 1940s, because America operated at an industrial scale that rendered traditional military calculations obsolete. The final accounting was written not in battle reports but in production statistics. The 90 destroyers launched in 6 months that had shocked Vice Admiral Ugaki in October 1943 were merely the beginning. By war's end, American shipyards had produced enough destroyers to replace Japan's entire pre-war destroyer force 3 times over, while simultaneously building carriers and battleships, and submarines and merchant ships in quantities that exceeded the combined output of every other nation involved in the war. This production, capacity, more than any tactical decision or strategic plan, determined the war's outcome. Japan had attacked a nation whose industrial potential they had observed, but never truly comprehended. They had seen the automobile factories of Detroit, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of the East Coast and West Coast. They had collected intelligence on American production capacity, but they had never made the intellectual leap required to understand what those numbers meant in practical terms. A shipyard that could launch a destroyer every 2 days wasn't just producing ships faster than Japanese yards. It was operating in a different industrial paradigm entirely, one where mass production techniques developed for consumer goods had been adapted to military hardware, where standardization enabled rates of production that traditional craftsman-based shipbuilding could never match, where worker productivity enhanced by adequate nutrition and democratic motivation exceeded the output of impressed or forced labor by factors of 2 or 3 or 5. The Japanese admirals, who had dismissed American destroyer production estimates as propaganda, had made the classic mistake of assuming that others would face the same constraints they faced. Japan, resource-poor and labor-constrained, could not have built 90 destroyers in 6 months under any circumstances. Therefore, they assumed America could not do so either. This assumption, based on their own experience but ignorant of American industrial reality, proved fatal to their strategic planning. When the 90 destroyers materialized, when the production statistics were confirmed by direct observation, when Japanese destroyer captains found themselves facing not 2 or 3 American destroyers but 10 or 15, only then did Japanese naval leadership fully grasp the magnitude of their miscalculation. By then, of course, it was far too late. The war had already been decided, not in the battles of Midway, Guadalcanal, or the Philippine Sea, but in the shipyards of America, where workers who would never be remembered built the instruments of victory at a pace the world had never seen. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.